I want to start by saying how delighted we are to be partnering with SNF Agora Institute, which I just think is such an amazing organization of civic engagement. Their mission so interacts with what we're doing. And if I were to summarize what we're trying to do at Open to Debate is show that it's possible to disagree with people about the facts and even about philosophy, but to do so in a way where we don't have to end up hating each other, but we can respect each other's points of views by listening to one another. And that's the thing that we aim to do. I'm just curious, given this topic and given where we are, how many in the audience work in AI or computer science, just by a show of hands? Quite a few of you. All right, so I just want to let you know that we try to operate these debates so that a general audience can understand. So maybe there will be times when you'll notice that I'll be asking for explanations of terminology, things like that. I'm just doing that so that we can reach that general audience. Our debates do go to a general audience. We broadcast them ultimately on public radio, and we release them on podcast, and we release them on YouTube. And they get, ultimately, in some cases, millions and millions of views, which is something that really delights us. We've been around for 18 years now doing this and proving the point that we can have civic discourse, which I think you're going to see demonstrated tonight. And we're going to start with some words from your president, Ron Daniels.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Hopkins Forum, the first to take place on our Homewood campus here in Baltimore. I wish I could be there with you this evening, but I could not miss the opportunity to share our excitement about this partnership with Open to Debate. You see, this series is an embodiment of our longstanding commitment here at Hopkins to nurture the free exploration and expression of ideas and the capacity for dialogue that is simultaneously rigorous and respectful. Ideals that are as essential to the flourishing of our democracy as they are to the critical truth-seeking mission of universities like ours. Those ideals are currently facing the headwinds of a cultural moment of polarization and hyperpartisanship, a moment in which too many of us view those with whom we disagree as enemies to be feared or silenced, rather than as fellow travelers deserving of respect and thoughtful discourse. Debates like this one aim to model for members of our broad-ranging community, and especially for our students, how we test and contest ideas around complex issues like those featured in the series. From Supreme Court reform to the rapid rise of artificial intelligence. It is evidence-driven dialogue like this, premised on the capacity to listen to and engage with diverging viewpoints, sometimes vehemently, even heatedly, that brings us closer to the truth. And as we work to build a new era of constructive civic discourse, today's forum demonstrates the skills of thoughtful and rigorous dialogue can bring us together in the shared pursuit of truth and truly drive democratic flourishing. So I'll close by thanking Open Debate for their continued partnership in organizing today's event and their commitment to nurturing the art of debate, and to our colleagues at the SNF Agora Institute who have brought both this evening and this series to fruition. Thank you to our distinguished debaters for offering their strongest arguments while approaching this evening with open minds. And thank you all for being here. I hope today's debate engages you, challenges you, and perhaps even inspires you to pursue this rigorous, respectful discussion on your own. Enjoy the evening.
I want to just continue the conversation that Ron Daniels started by welcoming two people to the stage. First, Hari Hahn, who is inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of Political Science, and faculty director of P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. And Leah Mathau, the person who oversees the editorial framework for the debates on our end. She's our chief content officer at Open to Debate, but really the spark that drives the engine that is Open to Debate by leading a great team and making these events. It's very hard to get 4 people on a stage to agree to debate. You do it relentlessly.
It's always a miracle.
Always a miracle. Well, you've pulled off the miracle again. Hari, I just want to ask you, as I mentioned at the beginning, your organization is so devoted to civic engagement. Why partner with what we're doing at Open to Debate?
Yeah, thanks. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Let me just start by saying, John and Leah, thanks so much for your partnership. It's been such a delight for our team at the SNF Agora Institute to be able to work with you all to really realize the vision of the Institute through the partnership with you guys. And for us at the Agora Institute, I think the vision, it really begins with the idea of the actual Agora. So those of you who remember your ancient history will remember that the Agora was a literal marketplace where people came together to go shopping, to talk about politics, to meet their neighbors, to hang out. And it was a kind of marketplace of the free and open exchange of ideas that really is at the heart of the vision that we seek to recreate. And a lot of the work that we've been trying to do at the Agora Institute is to create the modern day Agora in a variety of different settings, but to do so in a way that helps nurture the capabilities that people need to really make democracy work in the United States, all over the world, on our campus, everywhere. And so for us, being able to do events like this on some of the most pressing issues of the day, to try to think, model for our students and for our community the ways in which people can come together and have a really civil discussion in a way that we hope can hopefully point towards solutions, lead to new kind of conversations, and really animate the kind of discussion that really should be the hallmark of what makes democracy work all over the world. And so for us, it's been really exciting to be able to build this partnership. But I just want to say, as President Daniel said, that it's particularly exciting for us to be able to host this event here on campus, where we can have more of our students participate in the event with us, but then also our neighbors in Baltimore, so that this is something that we really want to make accessible outside the walls of the university to the entire community.
Well, we're delighted to have those members of the community here, as well as the students and the professors and faculty. And Leah, as again, getting this together is a miracle. What are you hoping to come from this miracle tonight?
Well, I just want to say thank you to SNF Agora and our partners at Johns Hopkins University. It's been extraordinary to work with such a talented team. We're delighted to be here in Baltimore tonight. We've spent a lot of time with the debaters tonight, and this is a topic that is urgent. It's in the news. The Trump White House announced new considerations around chip restrictions, and the AI race with China, some consider to be one of the really key issues of our time. So we're delighted to be leaning into this partnership, and as President Daniels said, we're at such a moment of division and divide, and to be able to bring experts to the stage and really have a vigorous competition of ideas in a civil, respectful, even nuanced way that hopefully helps to educate people here tonight who are interested in learning more, and inspire and influence lawmakers who may be listening. So delighted to be here tonight.
Okay, well, thank you both. Thanks very much, and we're going to get started. This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody, from Baltimore for an episode we are pleased to be producing in partnership with the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. That's where we are. We're on this beautiful Hopkins campus. And we're also, with this debate, in the middle of a still unfolding global and tech-centered situation centered on the growing rivalry between China and the US. And where one of the front lines in that rivalry, where the stakes appear to be among the highest, is the contest to be first in artificial intelligence. Not long ago, we saw a wild card thrown into the mix with DeepSeek, the Chinese AI model that they are claiming they produced at a fraction of the cost of ChatGPT and the like. That rattled a lot of people here who are looking for ways to make sure that China doesn't ever catch up. One idea is to keep China from getting its hands on the most advanced semiconductor chips upon which the currently most advanced AI is built. Indeed, in one of his last acts in office, Joe Biden greatly expanded a regimen of export controls. Now, President Trump is announcing that he's rescinding some of those controls and replacing them with different rules, also aimed at limiting China's access. So, this idea of stopping exports, does that make sense? Is there a downside? Is there a better way to stay ahead in the AI race? That's what we're going to be getting at in this debate, framed around this question: can the US outpace China in AI through chip controls? Let's meet our debaters. Answering yes to that question, I first want to welcome Lindsay Gorman. Lindsay is Managing Director and Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Technology Program and Venture Scientist at Deep Science Ventures. Lindsay Gorman, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, John.
Your partner, Lindsay, is a former member of the House of Representatives, also a former CIA officer. He also served on OpenAI's board before he left to run for president, the only candidate in that race with an extensive AI platform, and is now Chief Strategy Officer for Chaos Industries. Will Hurd, you are also First time new father. Congratulations to that, and welcome to Open to Debate.
Awesome to be here.
On the other side of the stage and arguing on the other side of the argument, saying that chip controls will not help the U.S. outpace China, I want to welcome Susan Thornton. Susan was a diplomat for 28 years, including serving as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, now Senior Fellow at the Yale Law School Paul Tsai China Center, also a former debater with us, so thank you for returning, and it's great to have you back on stage, Susan.
Great to be back, thanks.
And at the far end of the table, I want to welcome Paul Triolo, Senior Vice President and Partner at GGA Albright Stonebridge Group. That's a global business strategy firm where he focuses on all things China and all things technology. Pleasure to have you join us, Paul. Thanks for joining us on this stage.
Great to be here. Great to be here.
So we're going to get right to opening statements. This is where each of the debaters gets the stage, takes the floor to tell you in an uninterrupted way why they are arguing yes or no to the question that we are arguing, which again is, can the U.S. outpace China in AI through chip controls? And our first speaker is going to be Lindsay Gorman. Lindsay, you are answering yes to the question. The floor is yours.
The stakes are high, and the time to play our cards is now. Who's heard of DeepSeek AI? Many of you. Who has asked it, its model, for information about China's leader Xi Jinping or about Tiananmen Square? Maybe one, two, a few of you. The answer you get is, let's talk about something else. We cannot let an autocratic regime build and define the most consequential technologies of our era. The stakes are high. So a whole toolkit approach is needed to squeeze every inch of competitive advantage that we have out. No one tool alone will ensure that the United States will win the competition, but neither can we afford to leave anything on the table. Secondly, the time to play our cards is now. The United States has significant hard computing power advantages. That is, the ability to produce high-end chips designed specifically for training AI models. With our allies, we control a strategic choke point on compute, a bottleneck without which training these models is impossible to do efficiently. And China knows this. China has long sought to displace the United States as the global technology power. And in fact, early thinking about export controls on semiconductors was in fact informed by Chinese scholars who identified a handful of critical technology choke points that would stop China from achieving its own indigenization goals, i.e. building everything at home. Semiconductors were on that list. The US has gambled that this is the decisive decade for AI competition, that whoever takes the lead now will have outsized advantages. Properly implemented controls can have an effect and also have an increasing and compounded effect over time in retarding China's AI advantages and giving the United States a head start. Don't take my word for it. The CEO of DeepSeek himself has said, money has never been the problem for us. Bans on shipments of advanced chips are the problem, and they have to consume twice the computing power to achieve the same results. Despite headlines about Chinese advances, the reality is that chip controls have been effective. The United States has tools, and it should play its cards now. The stakes are high, and the time is now.
Thank you, Lindsay. Now to make an opening statement on the other side of the argument, Paul Triolo. Paul, you are arguing that the U.S. cannot outpace China in the AI race using chip controls. Your chance to make your argument.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think this is really one of the most important issues of our times. It hinges on the future of technology, the future of U.S.-China relations, the future of artificial intelligence, and the future of Taiwan. And so therefore, this issue touches on a range of problems that all need to be addressed. We believe that the export controls are not working and will not lead to U.S. dominance in AI. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, the goal of the controls has never really been stated very clearly. I've talked to many people on this. What I hear is the goal of the controls is to throw sand in the machine in China, to slow China down from developing AI. Now we know that Secretary Gina Raimondo, who oversaw a lot of the controls over the last 2 years, called this effort a fool's errand, quote unquote. And the second thing is, in terms of where China is now, most experts believe that Chinese companies are only 3 months behind U.S. leaders in developing advanced AI models. I just today on my X feed posted a chart that's based on the latest benchmarks on that, so you can take a look at that. The other issue is that both the Biden and the Trump administration have changed the goalposts in terms of the controls, expanding the controls over the last 2.5 years, which has been really confusing to industry. It's disrupted global supply chains, and it's disrupted critical technology relationships, and this comes with steep costs. I was up late last night, in fact, reviewing some of the documents that illustrate that the controls are not working because they're constantly changing. The other thing is that proponents of the controls initially argue that they would be effective within a few years. Lately, I've heard people talk about a decade before the controls will be effective. That's a pretty big difference. So we don't think the controls will be effective in the future either, and that's because of several reasons. First of all, there is no agreed upon clear goal and no clear multilateral agreement on how to control these technologies. We have neither of those. Secondly, we have no real airtight enforcement mechanisms to make the controls work, and that's because the export controls were not designed to maintain U.S. technology hegemony. And third, and maybe most important, the Chinese view AI as a critical and essential to their economic development. So they're very capable. They have lots of STEM engineers. They're very capable of innovating, and in fact, the controls have forced China to move rapidly up the innovation ladder and to develop innovations around both semiconductors and AI technology, Witness, DeepSeek, and Huawei. And then finally, I think most importantly, is that the controls have really highlighted two very sensitive geopolitical issues. One is they've precluded so far any real collaboration between the US and China on the critical issue of AI safety. And this is happening just as we're on the verge of a key inflection point, the development of artificial general intelligence. And finally, the hardware base for AI resides in Taiwan, 100 miles off the Chinese coast in a very narrow strip. I've been there, it's amazing, but it's now in the middle of this contest, and the risks around conflict over Taiwan are heightened by the controls and the focus on AI dominance.
Well, I have to call you on time for that one.
Okay.
Sorry.
So anyway, I look forward to the discussion, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Next up, giving his opening statement, back to the center stage, is Will Hurd. Will, you are arguing that we can outpace China with chip controls. Please tell us why.
Ladies and gentlemen, clap once if you've heard this name before. Baidu. Okay. You can clap 2 times too if you want. That's fine. What about DJI? It's a Chinese manufacturer of drones. Okay. What about TikTok? Okay, everybody's heard of TikTok. These are 3 Chinese companies that operate in the United States of America freely, without problems. But their competitors, or their American counterparts, let's say Twitter, Google, Shield AI, are not able to operate in China. If there was a level of reciprocity between our 2 countries, we wouldn't be here having this debate about chip controls. I want the U.S. and China, and when I say China, I actually mean the Chinese government. Let's make that very clear. The problem with the Chinese government, not the Chinese people, not Chinese culture, definitely not Chinese Americans. The things that we've seen and the hate directed at this group over the last couple of years is unacceptable. So when I say China, I mean the Chinese government. I want us to be frenemies. Let's work on things we can work together on. We're compete on things that we can compete on. But that means you're doing it based on the rules that you've already accepted and said you're going to agree to. And if you violate those rules, guess what? You can't trust people. Now, you especially can't trust them when it comes to a technology that we know how they're going to use. I held the first hearings on AI in Congress. I've always talked about artificial intelligence, the equivalent of nuclear fission. Nuclear fission controlled, gives you nuclear power, unlimitless, clean power. Nuclear fission, uncontrolled nuclear weapons can kill everybody. I don't think that's hyperbole to explain that and to use that frame when it comes to artificial intelligence. The first mover advantage when we get to AGI, and I know we're going to have some debates on what does AGI mean, artificial general intelligence. There's different names for it. Really powerful AI that's going to be hard for a human to control. That's kind of my working definition. The first mover advantage of that is going to be so important, and it's going to be so big. And let me be frank, I don't think America we may not get it right. But I know for a fact the Chinese government won't, because we have seen them use technology in order to surveil their population, to try to predict what their population is going to do, to ultimately control this. And that's why when it comes to this powerful technology, one tool in our toolkit, and it's just one tool, is controlling chips going to the Chinese government.
And our fourth opening statement comes from Susan Thornton. Susan, again, you are arguing we cannot outpace China with in AI with chip controls. The floor is yours.
This is not a new Cold War. The US and China are in a competition, but it's not an ideological competition. It's not a military competition. It's an economic competition. And our two countries are the two most powerful countries in the world by a lot, and we are going to remain interconnected for the foreseeable future. And we just saw an example of the realization of this with the trade war that was launched on April 2nd and over the weekend was substantially walked back in a recognition that the two countries are inextricably intertwined. I think the main thing we should be asking ourselves about this question relating to chip controls and how it's going to affect the competition in AI is, what is the cost benefit of US policy actions? There are a lot of costs to this particular policy set without a lot of clear gains for the United States. And I'm not talking about China here. I mean, I don't think we should be taking into consideration China's gains and losses, but we have to face the reality that China is already building AI. It's going to be building AI. It's already within 3 months catch up to top US companies. Out of the top 1,000 AI scientists out there in the world, 1/3 of them are Chinese. China is 1/3 of the entire global technology market, so it's clearly a player. So the question is, what will we have to pay for trying to slow them down through the chip controls, and what are we gaining through the chip controls in slowing them down? The costs are obvious. Costs to US companies by giving up 1/3 of the technology market. There are costs to our relations with our allies who don't want to join us in these policies of chip controls because they don't see China as an enemy in the same way that we tend to. It's costing us, obviously, as has been mentioned, in relations with China. We have a lot at stake in our relationship with China, not just on this issue, on many, many, many issues. And certainly the one thing we need to do is avoid going to war. It's been mentioned that Taiwan, the most sensitive issue in US-China relations, has now been dragged right into the middle of this AI issue because they're the place that produces all the cutting-edge chips that we're trying to control. And of course, there's the huge cost that's just been alluded to, which is if we don't get our hands on AI controls between the two biggest AI powers, who knows who's going to be controlling and stopping AI from inflicting major damage on humanity. It's an area where the US and China need to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening statements. And now we move into the part of the program in which we sit and we talk. The debaters can address one another directly, ask questions of one another, take questions from me. Later we'll be taking questions from the audience. I want to just summarize what I think I'm hearing, the side that's arguing yes to chip controls, Will Hurd and Lindsay Gorman. I think fundamentally talking about a zero-sum situation in which whoever is moving, that the US already has an advantage, cannot let go of that advantage, that whoever dominates in this situation dominates in numerous ways that would have long-term consequences. They also make the case that China has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted because it doesn't abide by the rules. and that the first user advantage is just one that is not to be frittered away because the stakes are just too high. The team arguing against the proposition, Paul Triolo and Susan Thornton, they're talking about a broader context. First of all, making the case that we're not talking about a military rivalry, they say. We're not talking about an ideological rivalry. We're talking about an economic rivalry. It would asserting these kinds of controls would have consequences that would be negative for the United States and have to be brought into the calculation, including the impact on U.S. businesses that would lose a third of the market. Also the possibility of annoying and upsetting our allies who don't want to be any part of this. They raise the specter of war. And fundamentally, they're just saying that these things don't work, that China's already almost there, that they're only 3 months behind the US, and that these controls would take up to 10 years actually to have an impact. So we're hearing both different philosophical points of view and different differences on understanding of what these controls would actually do. I want to go first to you, Lindsay, as you had an opening statement in which you presented the situation as very much zero-sum and the stakes being enormously high. And your opponent's making the case that it's not ideological and it's not military, it's economic, and therefore a somewhat kind of contained thing, not as broadly dire as you're suggesting. If you could take a minute to respond to that.
Yeah, thanks, John. I would definitely say that it is ideological, and that even if we might not feel an ideological competition, absolutely our competitors in the Chinese government, as my partner so definitely pointed out, do see it that way. When we have a government trying to remake the world in its own autocratic image, it's hard not to think of these things through an ideological light. And I did want to take up some of the points that the other side made.
Before you do that, let me see what their response is to what you had to say. Who would like to respond to that point? Susan.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure what you mean by the other side seeing this as an ideological competition, but during the Biden administration, there was this framing about democracy versus autocracy. I mean, clearly the Chinese has a different governing system than ours. They have a way of dealing with their citizenry that they think, pertains to their particular way of managing their country. We don't want them to manage our country that way, but I don't think that this AI race necessarily extends to Chinese government imposing their ideology on the United States or anyone else. This was an issue in the Cold War with the Soviets saying that they could have a global sort of, communist sort of dominoes would fall, but that's not the situation here, I don't think. And so I think that that's just a mistaken way of thinking about this issue. And it sort of over-embellishes and causes a lot of resources to be spent and a lot of costs to be borne by the U.S. that aren't going to pay off.
First off, Susan, thank you for your service. I think my friends that have served in the Foreign Service don't get thanked enough for all the hard work that you do. And as a former, let's give all of them a round of applause. But Susan, I think we gotta take what they say about themselves, right? The Chinese government has made it very clear in their own documents, oftentimes in English, that they are trying to use their a mastery in a number of technologies in order to surpass the United States as the global superpower, right? Now, whether we want to call that ideological, economic, they are trying to displace us there. And how are they going to do that? If these tools are designed with their belief system entwined in it, and we have to start using that, it will have an impact on us, right? I know this is not a debate about TikTok. I'm sure y'all have probably done one before.
We have, actually. Yeah.
But the use of those tools to try to influence our society, and that is to me is ideological, because they are trying to imprint how they do business on site, and we know how they've adopted technology before. We know that, yes, it's a lot easier to pay for stuff in China than it is in the United States because everybody has to use the same thing. But we also know that they're using that to control their population.
Paul?
Yeah, I think I might just throw out a comment by the historian Ronald J on China, who says that he's a historian of China. He says that the least reliable way to predict where China will be in 20 years has always been to extrapolate in a straight line from where it is now. And I think that's an important thing to note here. So when we talk about this idea that China wants to overthrow the so-called rules-based international order, which the other side seems to be implying here, we have to be very careful about what that means. China, for example, participates in many parts of that global order now and has been successful, for example, in the global financial system. So there are many parts of that global order. Some of them China accepts and has benefited from. Some of them China is uncomfortable with and would like to change, and some of them it rejects. But China's there's the evidence that China wants to overthrow and replace the U.S., for example, in the international global order, I think is misplaced. Now, on the technology side, Will points out correctly that in his opening remarks, I thought that was very good. Talked about the reciprocity issue. That's a complicated issue. Yes, Baidu and can operate in other Chinese companies can operate in the U.S. and Twitter cannot operate in China. But again, those companies in China that can't compete in China are doing so because they're abiding by Chinese law. In the U.S., we do allow some companies not to operate in the U.S., like Huawei, by U.S. law. But we do allow DeepSeek, for example, is all over servers in the U.S. and other open source Chinese models are in the U.S. And then U.S. companies do operate in China. We have many clients that operate in China in the technology space. So it's a complicated issue to say there's no reciprocity.
All right. Lindsay, I cut you off before when you said you had some points that you wanted to respond to, and I wanted to get back to those points. But as the conductor of the orchestra here, I would like you to choose one of them that you want to rebut, and then let your opponents rebut to your rebuttal.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think I'd pick up on this critique that the goal is not clear and that most experts think China is 3 months behind. And specifically in regard to clarify what most experts mean by that timeline, I think it's the model itself. But no experts think that China is 3 months away from manufacturing the top-of-the-line semiconductors. And that's crucial to this debate because we're asking, can these chips slow down? And I think that was a very clearly articulated goal, slow down China's progress. And in the words of former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, when he announced some of these controls, to maintain as large a lead as possible. I think that's a clearly articulated goal. And in the case of this 3-month timeline, what we've seen with DeepSeek AI is that, in fact, it has benefited from advances in the U.S. ecosystem. And it has also trained its model on generations of chips before they were controlled.
So what are they most wrong about, are you saying, so I can let them respond to it?
That 3 months is an accurate timeline for the overall AI competition.
Paul, I think that was your point.
But I would say that if you take it by the measure of producing a semiconductor, I mean, China's been working, I think the main critique of this would be that what we've done is we've massively incentivized a very dynamic Chinese innovation ecosystem to come up with all kinds of ways to get around this, and they're working very hard on indigenous innovation. I mean, CEOs like Bill Gates and Jensen Huang of Nvidia have both said that what we're doing is the Chinese will go on without us. We've massively incentivized their innovation ecosystem to develop all kinds of technologies, and we see that with DeepSeek. We see that in other areas. It's not keeping them from catching up on AI, which is the question that we're supposed to be discussing today.
Let me just add 2 fingers on that. I think it's a great point, Susan. And it's interesting because, yes, there are 2 issues. One is the software and sort of the model development and applications. On the semiconductor side, though, right now, Chinese companies have stockpiles of existing U.S. GPUs, for example. They have their own indigenous sort of in-house GPUs they're using, and they have some Huawei GPUs that Huawei is beginning to produce that are pretty advanced. And so for the next 2 to 3 generations of model development, they have plenty of compute, for example, to do this. And in the meantime, then, as Susan notes, we've incentivized the domestic industry to get much better. So companies are collaborating amongst each other. They're trying to overcome some of these bottlenecks and choke points.
I want to let the other side respond to that. What I'm extracting from that is they're saying that what's already happened is already teaching the Chinese that they have to do it on their own, and they're starting to do it on their own, and they don't need us to do it on their own. Will?
I think that's some of the flawed thinking that has been going on about how we've looked at China for quite some time. chip control specifically, again, I say it's a tool in the toolkit, is not going to prevent the Chinese government from developing or continuing to develop this. We know this is on their 10-year plan in order to. They are making investments, but saying that this is going to increase that timeline, they're already trying to do it. So the goal is to slow them down and not let them use our technology in order to build upon. And we also know that if the Chinese government invades Taiwan and tries to take Taiwan, one of the strategic objectives is to corner 70% of the advanced semiconductor manufacturing, right? So saying that.
But I think your opponents are saying they're more likely to do that. They raised the specter of war, and that continuing to heat up the atmosphere would make that sort of scenario more likely. Am I getting that right?
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm. You're preventing Taiwan from giving the chips to China and creating a dynamic there.
Why give our adversaries? And look, I think part of the reason that there's debate about this is, are they an adversary or not? Right? Are they trying to surpass us or not? Like, I think
very
that's
quick question.
a whole.
Do we know the clear answer to that? I just want to. Yes or no, or not sure?
Most China experts would say that that's not really what their ambition
okay, I just wanted to know what your opponents felt about that.
I don't think there'd be a debate about that, but trying to surpass us in what way? I mean, I don't think it's very realistic
artificial intelligence, quantum computing, LiDAR, they want to make sure that
that's the economic competition, right?
But to corner.
Shouldn't
corner
they
the
be
global
doing
market
that?
so
If
that
you were
they
Chinese,
can decide
you
the
would be
rules of
doing
the road. So that they can decide the rules of the road, right? So that we're already seeing them in multilateral forums trying to change rules that benefit them and their style of doing business. So yes, they are using economic power to achieve these broader objectives. And whether you want to call that economic or ideological, it is ultimately trying to reduce our role.
China's growing more powerful. That's true. And so with that, it gets more influence in the global system. That's true. And with that, maybe they want to make adjustments to certain global institutions. I mean, at this point, the U.S. is withdrawing from all those global institutions, so we're making it very easy for them to do that. But economic power is what most countries aspire to. They want to grow their economies, and through technology.
I want to draw Paul and Lindsay back into the conversation. And Lindsay, what's another point that you wanted to rebut?
Yeah, this argument, but if I could also just...
You want to respond to that before?
Yeah, also respond to that quickly with just a data point, which is that China's indigenization efforts far predate U.S. export controls. One example in the recent past is in 2019. The Chinese government issued a directive that all government and most state-owned enterprises should remove all foreign technology within 3 years. These are long-standing goals. But I did also want to pick up on this point that Paul made initially on AI safety. I think no one wants these technologies in the hands of terrorists. No one wants AI-enabled bioweapons to be developed. But we've seen time and time again that conditioning our own national security, our own economic advantage, to Susan's point, that this is an economic competition, and who writes the rules, who succeeds will write the rules of the future. We don't want to compromise that for a shared objective, which should be a shared objective on AI safety. And we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We have a history of arms control negotiations with some of our fiercest adversaries. That doesn't mean we shouldn't also try to control technologies from going to them, even as we have diplomacy there. And China has used this time and time again. Look at conversations around climate, look at conversations around pandemics. And at the end of the day, it's the United States conceding in the hopes that China will do something in our shared interest.
Paul.
Let me just respond to the idea that China always intended to go it alone, for example, in semiconductors. This is really not the case. I talked to many people in China, and the semiconductor industry is particularly unique. It's a global industry, and no country before the controls has tried to do it, to develop all the technologies necessary to manufacture advanced semiconductors on its own. It's very difficult. So as long as Chinese companies could buy the best equipment from U.S., Japanese, and Dutch makers, for example, they were happy to do that. But once we put restrictions on that, that forced Chinese companies, indigenous companies, to work together to improve the capabilities of those domestic companies, who then can compete, by the way, against U.S. companies outside of China. So that's one of those costs that I mentioned earlier, of the disruption of supply chains around that issue. So it really isn't the case that China intended all along to be self-sufficient in semiconductor manufacturing.
I'd have to push back a little bit to my friend Paul's statement there. The Chinese have always had about 10% of global supply of advanced chips. Taiwan has about 70, and then the mix in South Korea, some in Japan. And so saying that this was a nascent industry is not true, because 10% of the global market in something this advanced is pretty significant, and that predated any of these kinds of debates. But to my friend Lindsay's point, I work for a company now called Chaos. We sell radars, and if I want to sell a radar to our friends, like I can give an X and Y, a plane, but I can't give Z, right? I can't give you altitude, and that requires a level of export control. We have these kinds of tools in many technologies that has existed for a long time, and the reason we have them is to make sure that the people that are using for the intended purpose and not going to ultimately erode our national security.
Yeah, I don't think our side is saying that we shouldn't have any export controls, and we've had export controls in many technologies on China for a long time, and since the 80s, really. And in 2019, we imposed a ban on China importing the highest level of lithography machines from the Netherlands, which effectively prevents them from being able to manufacture advanced chips. And we did it through the Wassenaar mechanism, which is a joint multilateral export control. All of our partners agreed, the Dutch agreed. It was a very well thought through and tight control. What we would be arguing, I think, is that doing that makes sense because it's bought into by everyone in the world. It's understood by the Chinese. They don't like it, but they understand why we wouldn't, give them the latest cutting edge technology. It wouldn't impinge on all their memory chips that they're manufacturing. It wouldn't have impinged that much on US companies, and it was an effective control to keep them from getting the cutting edge. What we're arguing against is all these latest controls and all these changing of the goalposts and all of these other things are really disruptive, are making an enemy of China, are not favored by our partners, and are major costs with very little benefit.
Yeah, I would just say in response to that we needed to control those lithography machines is evidence of exactly the point that China has been trying to make its own
Could
chips.
you explain for people who don't know when you're referring to lithography machines?
These are manufactured by the Dutch company ASML, the highest end machines that go into the chip manufacturing process.
So they're necessary.
They're necessary for the chips. If China were content to just buy chips made by Nvidia all the time and had no designs on its own indigenous process, why would it need to buy the DUV and EUV machines from the Netherlands? And I actually agree with Susan that a multilateral export control regime, an update to Wassenaar, maybe that doesn't have Russia in it, would be a better mechanism for us to multilaterally, especially among democratic allies and partners, implement these controls in an effective way. The issue is we don't have the time. This 3-month window on the models, a longer window on the chip manufacturing, these are critical days, weeks, months, and years where the AI playing field is being set and the market dynamics are being set. So we can't wait a decade to set up the perfect export control regime. I think we absolutely should, but in the meantime, the US has to lead, and we saw that with these chip controls. We'll lead, and we encourage our allies to follow, and that's what happened with Japan and the Netherlands, that we were willing to take that first step.
Okay, I have one more question I want to ask before we get to audience questions, but I want to let you respond first, Paul.
Yeah, I just want to respond to Will's comment, and I agree that there are some technologies that of course have long been controlled for very specific military and use purposes, right? And this is a long history of this. The problem with AI, though, is that, for example, in China, the vast majority of this technology is being used in civilian applications. Healthcare, scientific discovery, materials science, all these areas where with no military application. So it's a dual-use technology, yes, but the military applications, for example, of Gen AI right now are pretty minimal, right? AI in general, that there are other applications that are being used, but the vast majority of the development that's going into AI, all the companies, the civilian companies that are developing this are all developing this for enterprise and consumer use. So the problem is that it's a dual-use technology, and defining what the military applications are is very difficult. And so far, I haven't heard, for example, a really serious discussion or justification for restricting AI specifically for military end use.
All right, so that's actually goes to my question. I would like to ask you to think through, for people who are not very, very entrenched in this topic, when you kind of portray a very, very dire situation if China ultimately dominates. Number one, what ultimately dominates means. And secondly, paint a graphic picture of the world where that's the case. Your opponents have painted a picture of a world where we might go to war with China over the situation, but you have said the situation is grossly serious, but without actually painting the picture of what that world is and what happens to us if China dominates.
Let's start on the battlefield. Use of autonomy in the battlefield. We've seen this play out in Ukraine, and how the asymmetry of warfare has been enabled because of the use of AI, where you can now have a $20,000 drone blow up a $60,000 radar that's protecting a country. And I can make the argument that what we see. Yeah, well, I can make the argument that what we see in Ukraine is going to be just a fraction of the kind of activity you would potentially see in the first island chain, the level of sophistication. Let's take cybersecurity. We have seen in 2025 a 4,000% increase, 4,100 and some change increase of AI-created spear phishing campaigns. Now, that's a 4,000 increase, but the number of spear fishes that have gotten through firewalls and such that have been crafted by AI is about 49%. So half of cyber attacks have been generated by AI. How do you make that a military application? That's difficult, because guess what? That same AI is going to create that email that helps me buy that table I just bought for the renovation of my house.
Lindsay, do you want to sketch this in more?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are brilliant points. In terms of the picture, this is about who controls the fundamental means of production of the next century. And in China, we have a coercive power, one that issues cyber attacks, that uses economic leverage when countries vote for a dissident to win a Nobel Peace Prize, or when they criticize the Chinese government. So the world that I'm imagining is one where someone speaks out against something the Chinese government has done, and their access to the new personalized medicine they're developing goes away. The lights go off, not to mention a sophisticated surveillance regime that they're already piloting in the Xinjiang province.
Lindsay, what is it about the AI, weaponization of AI, that would be different, say, for the 65 years that both the Soviet Union and the United States had a nuclear weapon? Neither attacked the other. They were both nuclear superpowers. They both held this danger in their hands. I think you're suggesting that in AI it's different. There can only be one dominant power?
Yes and no. I think the key difference there is that it's true that AI is a general purpose technology. It's not just a military technology. Yes, the US and the Soviet Union had mutually assured destruction and incentives not to unleash those weapons in a very hotly contested situation. But with AI, this is also an economic argument.
Okay. I've let your opponents talk for some time, so you get the last word before questions to respond to what the kind of dire situation that they're talking about now in detail.
Good.
Yeah, I think what I've heard in talking to people about this, I think the former White House czar was on Ezra Klein podcast, and he was asked, what does the world look like when China gets to AI first, AGI first, again, advanced artificial general intelligence? And he immediately went to the cyber issue, that somehow if China had an advantage in AI, they would take down U.S. critical infrastructure. And frankly, I just don't buy that as an argument, because I think that would not likely be the first response of the Chinese government. First of all, as I think the moderator noted, the definition of AGI is very complicated. We're not going to wake up one morning and know we have AGI, so it's going to be a continuum. And so whoever gets to an advantage will have time to figure out what to do with it, but I don't think the first reaction is going to be to launch a cyber attack. So the problem is the export controls are basically predicated on this idea of preventing China from getting there first while we get there first. And what that means is not very well defined, and that's the problem. Is when I mentioned earlier, the end goal of this hasn't really been defined. Like, what does that world mean? It hasn't been discussed publicly. While all these measures have been taken, there hasn't been a really frank, open discussion of what the end game is here and why it's so important to stop China from getting there first, if that's really the way to look at it at all.
I think to see China as the biggest danger that's headed our way, stemming from AI and AGI, is really misplacing our focus on what we should be doing to make sure that we're all going to be able to use this technology, use it for the benefit of humanity, and have it be safe. And China is a huge part of that equation, and we need to be working with them. And also, I mean, just not to mention, like 1/3 of the top AI scientists in the world are Chinese. So, I don't even think it's possible to do this in terms of them not getting there and us getting there. It's just not going to happen that way.
All right, I'd like to go to some questions now, and we've actually asked some members of the community to stand by to ask some questions, so that we would have somebody to go to first. And right down in front, if you could stand up, and if you would also tell us your name and if you're connected to Hopkins, we would love to hear that.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Coco Yao. I'm a senior student at Hopkins. I'm majoring in biomedical engineering and minoring CS. I'm here today because I want to learn how the decisions are going to shape the future of AI and how that affect global dynamics. So my question is the containment going to be sustainable, because the AI is just going to keep developing, and with the two countries getting increasingly strained, are they going to sit down and then make like a checkpoint for, is the AI development safe, or like kind of like a standard.
Like an arms control situation?
Yeah, kind of like that.
All right. Yeah, let's take that. Does anybody see this getting sorted through
Look, I wish we could do that. I wish you could have track 2 conversations on safety around AI, right? Because here's the thing that we are learning. You're learning that the more powerful AI gets, the less likely it is to follow human intention, right? And for the ability to have the conversation, pull in that third of some of the great AI brains in the world together to have that conversation would be great. But guess what? The Chinese government is not allowing those track 2 kinds of conversations, right? Maybe if you had that kind of debate, they would show some indication, because you can make a scenario that the real enemy could potentially be the AI, right? And so yeah, I wish that was the case, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Look, can I also respond? So I think it's important to understand that that China is very interested in discussions on AI. I was in the Paris AI Action Summit in February when China, in fact, launched its AI Safety Institute. So China is very eager to have those discussions. The problem is that right now the U.S. government primarily is standing against China's participation in some of the global efforts to rein in AI. So we have this AI safety community. And all the major leaders of AI, the founders of machine intelligence like Yoshua Bengio and Jeff Hinton, support China's participation in this. But it's a complicated issue because industry is also split. Some of the leading model developers like Anthropic and OpenAI don't support China's participation. And so right now, we're in the middle of a big international discussion between these AI summits that are held every year to determine whether China will be allowed to participate. But the Chinese government over the last year has come around to the idea of that it wants to participate in global dialogues around AI safety.
Thanks for your question. Do we have another question?
Okay, I'm Sam Carlisle, Johns Hopkins Institute for Data Intensive Engineering and Science. People have talked about the problem of running out of internet, right? And sort of the out from that is the conversations that users have with with the AIs, right? But not everybody's conversation is as informative as everyone else's, right? So that sort of becomes, at some point, assuming your hardware keeps up, that becomes what the competition is about. So like at what point, or like when do we get there? Are we already there? And when we're there, what does that competition look like?
Will?
Well, look, I think you're getting at the amount of the information that you have to. It's like if you're asking a data question, right? The data that's going into these systems, and if you have garbage in, you have garbage come out. And is the competition really about who is putting the best data in? Heck yeah, that's what everybody's trying to figure out. Is you have to have data, you have to have compute, and you have to have power to inform that compute. And so yes, the ability, but this is also one of the scary things. When you start having artificial data informing these systems, when you have garbage informing these systems, it's a problem. But I don't think you're going to be at a point where you're relegating that. I also think that the U.S. always has to have, we're always going to have less data because we have a little thing called civil liberties. And that our competitors in China are able to take whatever data they ultimately want. So I think they're always going to have an advantage when it comes to the data piece, but there's no way that you can potentially control that in this export control fashion.
And we'll still need compute to make use of that data.
I'm not sure that's really the nub of the issue. I think right now, for example, we're in the age of agentic AI. So we have very capable models that are going out post-training. So if they're trained on a certain set of data, but then they're going out and they're using techniques like RAG, which is a retrieve, augment, and generate, which means they're going out on the internet and they're grabbing new data, up-to-date data, and they're doing deep research on this. DeepSeek does this. Manus AI, which is a Chinese company, does this. Claude Sonnet is doing this very well. So we're really on the cusp of a different type of AI being deployed, where post-training is really important. Inference training, where the model is doing much more after it's based on its training data, but also using and leveraging new data. So that issue I think becomes less important. But China's training. There's only a small percentage of data that China's not using that's different from the U.S. So I think the idea that like China's AI is going to be authoritarian or is going to have some censorship. Of course it's going to, because that's abiding by Chinese law. But the basic data sets that all the major model users are using are pretty similar at one level. There's only a small delta.
I just wanted to make one more point, because we're talking about data and we're talking about compute, but the other thing you need to be an AI leader is you need talent. And the US used to be #1 by far at gathering all of the international talent together in the US and our various AI labs, and honing that tech talent and getting the most most innovative research out of that. But I have to say, lately we've been bleeding talent back to China, and that is not good for whatever it is that we're trying to do in our AI innovation.
Would you say that American universities still have the edge?
I think we still have the most top-tier AI researchers from multiple countries, but like I mentioned, a lot of them are Chinese, and a lot of the Chinese talent is going back to China now because they see that as a more dynamic ecosystem for research.
Here's a topic for debate: making sure that if you come to a U.S. university to study AI or quantum or something like that, you get to stay here and you have a visa to be able to do that.
Would you come debate that with us?
Yeah, look, any day of that. I've been in those debates already.
Yeah, but I think a Biden administration official said that we're happy for Chinese to come and study the liberal arts, but not STEM.
Right.
So
I think we have another question coming down.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking my question. My name is Mark O'Connor, and I am a cyber instructor down in Washington, D.C. at Jacksonville High School. My question is, this week the Trump administration announced to be rolling back some of the Biden administration's chip export controls. With this new strategy, it promised to put forth an inclusive AI strategy while simultaneously keeping sensitive technology away from our adversaries. However, the details so far have been pretty sparse. My question to the panel is this: what ways would you recommend to the administration to pursue these, or what ways and means would you recommend to the administration to achieve these ends?
I think that's a really useful question. And again, we're not sure exactly what the new administration's new plan is. But I want to go to Lindsay, because you're doing a lot of thinking about what the controls should be. What should they be?
Absolutely. I think we need to recognize that China is trying to make up the difference. There are massive smuggling networks that have emerged. So our controls need to be effective. They need to crack down on some of these smuggling networks. They need to address the realities that some of these these models can be used in the cloud. So we need to tighten up these controls. We need to pour a lot more money into enforcement of the controls in a new way. And these are new controls. I don't think we got it right the first time. And I don't think with nuclear technology, we also reevaluated and refined our controls over the years. So I hope that the Trump administration will do that it will realize that this is a competitive advantage we have on compute that isn't going away, even though on data, China has more AI and bio data on the United States population than the US does. But compute is an advantage we have, and these are new controls. We are controlling manufacturing equipment. We're controlling U.S. persons from helping China to build its own domestic semiconductor manufacturing chain. So we need to refine how to use them and how to use them smartly, and I hope that's what the administration will do.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is the Trump administration has pulled back the AI diffusion framework, which was a rule passed late in the Biden administration and divided the world into tiers, 3 tiers, allies, adversaries, and everybody else. The industry didn't like this, and many countries that were relegated to tier 2 didn't like this. So the administration has basically scrapped that formulation in favor of a global licensing regime and bilateral agreements, which we saw this week with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that were negotiated by the Trump administration, because the industry's argument is the way to maintain U.S. technology dominance in AI is to let other countries build, for example, AI data infrastructure using AI hardware that originates from the U.S. And so that's the new policy the Trump administration is pursuing. And so that they'll be issuing a new rule that will encapsulate this new approach, and also will also be adding new controls that are targeting some of the ways that Chinese companies could circumvent the controls.
Thank you for your question. We have another question coming down the aisle.
Hi, I'm Lulu. I'm from both the United States and China, so I can see this from both sides. My question is to the pro side.
Are you a student here as well?
No.
Okay.
But I tutor students, actually. My question is for the pro side. China has 1.5 billion people, and 65% use mobile technology for everything, generating an immense amount of data. And as we know, data is the lifeline of AI. If the US cannot match that data advantage or even come close, how can it possibly outpace China in AI, even with chip controls?
Have better algorithms. Have better algorithm that requires less data. And look, the agentic question. I think we're going to see in a handful of years, not a lot of years, that the style in which you do it is way we can continue to have more powerful outcomes without while being disadvantaged in that data case. And so to me, it's the refinement, the better algorithms, better understanding of weights. And that's how we can pull it off.
And I'd add, I think we're going to need to find a way to do privacy protective machine learning, so that we can up our data edge. But in the meantime, that data needs to be processed with computing power.
We have 1 minute left. I think we can take one more question.
Hello, I'm Rob Hirschfeld. I'm CEO of a technology company that specializes in data center automation. So I have a front row seat to this. And my question is, the U.S. is predominantly driven by enterprises and private companies doing this work, whereas the Chinese government, to Congressman Hurd's point, is a state actor. Do you think that plays a role in this decision?
That's a really tightly focused question. I appreciate that.
Heck yeah, it is. right? And ultimately, I think that's the ideology, right? We want to get back to this question of ideology economic. The ideology of that this is driven by the state versus enterprise, and the ability to use all levers of government in order to compete with on a global stage when others don't have the benefit of that, right? And so absolutely, I think that's another element of why why a tool in the toolkit should be the chip control.
And real quick though, in China, all the major AI developers are private sector, and DeepSeek, in fact, was very interesting because it was a hedge fund that decided to switch from financial models to AI models, and there was no government subsidies, no government intervention. So what I say is the bureaucrats in Beijing were just as surprised as the bureaucrats in Washington and the Silicon Valley AI developers with the success of DeepSeek.
And I don't think the solution is for, the U.S. government to be more like the Chinese system. I think we should be confident in our system. We don't have a lot of government control over our private sector companies. That's been a good thing for our entire run. And I think it makes it difficult to implement these kind of controls to some extent because we don't have a huge sprawling regulatory infrastructure at customs and BIS at commerce and all of these places, anti-smuggling agents everywhere. I mean, that's part of the problem with the controls is we don't have that huge regulatory infrastructure, but maybe we're going to have to create it if we keep changing the rules every 2 weeks and trying to perfect the controls. I mean, it sounds like what we have in mind is kind of the same model as sort of sanctions on North Korea, sanctions on Iran. I mean, these things don't work. Trying to perfect and tighten the sanctions, it just doesn't work. Believe me, 28 years in the State Department, I can tell you, people will find a way around these things, and it's very hard for the U.S. government to stop that.
Okay, I'm going to move on to closing statements, except, Lindsay, if you can take 15 seconds to respond if you want to.
Yeah, I would say, I would point to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. 60, 70, 80 years in the making, only 9 nations have nuclear weapons. I'd say that's not bad. These tools can work. Sometimes we have to innovate them, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Thank you, debaters, for this round of the debate. And now we move on to closing statements, and this is where each of the debaters again takes the center stage and tries to persuade you that they are right in arguing yes or no on our central question is, can the U.S. outpace China in AI through chip controls? And speaking first, Lindsay, you just had the last word, and you get the first word in this round. The floor is yours as you argue. The answer is yes.
Our opponents in this debate are seized of a defeatism that says America can't outcompete China or slow its progress on the technology of our time. So let's not try, let's not bother, it's going to hurt US companies too much. Well, our view is that we can do better than that America must do better than that. Our companies are doing well. Nvidia's market capitalization is just shy of the GDP of the United Kingdom, and that's even not selling its top-line chips to China. Instead, those chips got sold primarily in the United States. There isn't an issue here with demand. It's with supply. So doing better means that we have to throw what we can at this problem now with a smart application of tools. And I'd like to take us back several years to the early 2000s, when in 2002 Google had just 16% of the search query market. By the late 2000s, it was at 90%. And today, here in 2025, it has maintained this lead for decades. Meta in 2012 had just crossed this threshold of 1 billion active users. 13 years later today, it holds 59% of the social media market, only now getting a challenge from China's TikTok. There are advantages in market dynamics, in customer bases, to coming out of the gate early, to building applications early, and to securing an early lead. And that's the purpose of these controls, to slow down China's advancement so that US and companies from our allied countries and our partners can take the lead. There is an advantage to a head start.
Thank you, Lindsay. Paul, again, you are arguing that we cannot outpace China in AI using chip controls. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think that in the words of a longtime China specialist I was listening to last night, we imagine export controls can protect us from China draining our precious bodily fluids. And I think that it's important to note that highlights the issue that these technologies we're talking about, particularly semiconductor manufacturing, are applied technologies. So the mistaken belief is that in controlling those technologies, we can control what China does. In fact, there are many ways to get to the different ends. So we mentioned earlier this idea of advanced lithography. So what the controls have done is to force China then to figure out a way to do advanced lithography. So right now they have 3 teams pursuing different paths to develop advanced lithography. And at the end of the day, they're going to come up with new innovations for their companies, and those companies then are going to be able to be more competitive both domestically and globally. And so at the end of the day, they'll become self-sufficient and also be able to sell that equipment to other places that we might not like. So I think it's really important to note that, and particularly when it comes to technology independence, that process that China is now engaged in will make it even more independent from places like Taiwan. And again, coming back to that risk, will increase the risk of conflict around Taiwan. So if we want to protect our precious bodily fluids and preserve Taiwan's status and ensure the safety of advanced AI, export controls are in fact working against us at all levels. Thank you.
Will Hurd, the stage is yours for your closing.
25 years ago, when I graduated from university, I joined the CIA. My job was recruit spies and steal secrets. Best job on the planet. I did it overseas in order to protect our homeland. And at that time, if you would have talked about, a technology that was made in China, I would have said it was a knockoff. It was garbage. It wasn't very good. Talk about made in China now, it's high quality. But I could also make the argument 9 times out of 10, it was made in America first because they stole it from us. They stole it from other places to integrate it into their systems. We have to begin with this notion that we are in a conflict. They know it. They say it in their own materials, right? And why would we give an edge to our competitor that is trying to use that tool against us? It's not our only tool. Controlling trips is not our only tool. I agree, we have to out-innovate, and I'm going to put my money on American innovation, on American stick-to-itiveness, on our freedoms and openness in order to do this. But let's use all the tools in our toolkits in order to make sure that we win this challenge. I was on the board of OpenAI. 4 months before we released ChatGPT, I interviewed Sam Altman and the CTO of Microsoft on stage, and there was a bunch of tech luminaries, names you would know. After the interview was over, one of these tech luminaries came up to me and said, "F you, Will Hurd. Why'd you let him talk about all this craziness that ain't never gonna happen?" And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'd been using GPT-3 for several months. 4 months later, ChatGPT comes out. End of the week, we have 100 million users. Nobody thought at that time that was possible. We can't stay in that thinking. This technology is evolving so fast. The next 35 years is going to make the last 35 years look like we were a bunch of monkeys playing in the dirt with sticks. And at that time, are we going to say, did we do everything we can to make sure our way of life continued and was maintained? Thank you.
And our final closing comes from Susan Thornton. Susan, again, you are arguing that we cannot outpace China with chip controls. Your chance one more time to tell us why.
Look, making the AI competition with China a zero-sum game not only will not work, it is dangerous. We don't have to give China the cutting-edge chips. We did that back in 2019 with restrictions on EUV lithography technology. That was a move that was widely supported in the international community. It's an easy execution, easy implementation, everyone agrees, and China accepts it, that they're not going to have the most cutting-edge technology chips. Now we say, China's just a little bit behind us in where it is in AI, which is the question that we're debating today. So it seems like with all of the things we've done since then, we haven't actually slowed China down that much, and the costs have been very high. The cost in relations with China, who think that we're trying to throttle their economy when they have 1.5 billion people, many of whom still live at or just above the poverty line. Cost in relations with our allies, who think that we have kind of gone way overboard in our obsession about this chip controls in China. And also, it's been a huge cost to our companies, as we've heard. Now, I think basically, we're constantly responding on these chip controls. In my view, it's partially a kind of a political impulse in the US driven by fears of China. And I think this is completely overblown and unwarranted. I think we should make sure that we focus on the things that are going to matter to our children and their children, which is the long-term AI competition, which, if not constrained and bounded by international agreements and by cooperation among countries who agree on what the boundaries are, it'll be a very dangerous world. I certainly think that the Chinese believe that this technology needs to be bounded. They would like to be in conversation with the US about this. We're the two leading AI powers. Everyone else in the world thinks we ought to be talking about this, and I think we should focus on that instead of worrying about changing the chip controls every 2 weeks, because that won't work, and it's going to cost us a lot. Thank you.
And I would like to ask the debaters to come forward with me, the two of you on this side and two of you on this side. That is a wrap on this debate, and I want to thank you for being such a fantastic audience. Again, I want to thank Hopkins and the SNF Agora Institute for making this partnership happen. I want to thank everybody who asked questions. I want to thank everybody who lined up to ask questions and didn't get to. I appreciate your patience. Just want to remind you that the Hopkins Forum is a debate series that is brought to you by the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins and open to debate, and we are the nation's only nonprofit, nonpartisan debate organization. This is the second of 8 debates that we have planned between the two of us. Some people I want to thank are philanthropic supporters at Open to Debate, especially our founder and chairman, Robert Rosenkranz, and the Rosenkranz Foundation. But most of all, I want to thank these 4 debaters for doing what they did, which was to demonstrate and embody the spirit that we try to communicate, that people can come here and disagree very, very deeply, but respectfully and civilly, and by all of us being able to listen to that, we learned more. So I just want to thank all 4 of you, and I want to say that's it from me, John Donvan. We'll see you next time, and I'd love to see a handshake.